We are live.
All right, friends or friend or my mom or whoever, welcome to, I guess we're going to call it 99% mental.
90% mental.
90% mental. Well, see, we've already made some improvements to the show. I don't know if this is a show. I don't know if this is a podcast. It's going to be super informal, but essentially we're open if people would like to hang out with us. And my friend David, who you're going to see right here, Dr. David Klonsky. He's a professor of psychology at the University of British Columbia up here in Canada. And I'm Robin Black. I'm I guess a combat sports analyst or a martial arts expert or something. I don't know what I do. I talk about fighting on TV. But David and I are getting together weekly-ish, and we have been working to write a book together on combat sports psychology. David, am I getting this right?
I think that sums it up.
Yeah. I mean, and this is about as formal as we're going to get. So if you are joining us, this is our first time together. We are probably going to do this for weeks, months, or years, as long as it takes to write this book. And as I said, David is a professor of psychology. So he's dedicated his life to researching psychology, but he's also a black belt in karate. He studies Brazilian jiu-jitsu. He had an amateur MMA fight. I fought a bunch of times, and 60, 70 hours a week I've been studying and researching martial arts and the way people watch martial arts and the psychology and the philosophy and just growing as a martial artist. I spend all my time digging as deep as I can into researching the topic, and the interesting tidbits that I find, I try to bring back to people. So when I can do that here with a friend and a psychologist, I kind of think we might be able to write a book, and that's what we're doing here. David, am I kind of right on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've gotten to talk about this a couple times. I've gotten to be on your show a couple times, and it just seems like the topic of the role of psychology in mixed martial arts and combat sports generally has almost no end to it, and it's absolutely fascinating talk, a fascinating topic. It's what if you remember, it's what got us to be friends a couple years back when I saw your Carlos Condit breakdown, and you were referencing some work on what psychologists have called the adaptive unconscious and how that leads him to flow from one move to the other and to flow from one recognition of what's happening to another one moments later, better than other fighters. And I've been a fan of your work since, and I've also really enjoyed our conversation since. And so I figure there's got to be a book to be written on this about all the ways psychology plays out in mixed martial arts, what parts fighters are born with, what parts fighters get better at. Everyone talks about, how fighting is 90% mental. This is something that, Dominique Cruz actually tweeted me about, and, George St. Pierre's talked about that. Randy Couture's talked about it too. And so, I'm just happy to be able to have the conversation. What does that mean that it's 90% mental?
Yeah. And, is it really? Because in a way, everything's 100% mental. Right now I have a computer screen in front of me. I'm physically grabbing it. I put this shirt on, but all of those things are my brain deciding what to do, my brain making choices. In a way, not only is fighting 90% or more mental, but everything is 100% mental. Whether it's physical, it's spiritual, it's emotional, it's activity that's happening in your brain. So, how we
anything physical matters without the mental part. And yet at the same time, and I say this as someone who has had less success than you have fighting in the cage, there's a way in which if you don't, if your natural strength is capped or is capped lower than the guy you're fighting, you could actually do everything right mentally and still just lose and still not be good enough. And so, and that's just one of the many fascinating, I think, dialectics, of this topic is, what you're saying is true. Everything starts mentally. If someone's not going to be able to operate mentally, if they're held back, they could be the most physically gifted fighter in the world and they just won't perform. And yet at the same time, there is a way in which you need some physical attributes that are, to succeed. And in the end, it's about integrating these. For me, that's always been what's attracted me to sports, and especially combat sports. Is you've got to integrate the physical and mental preparation in a really intense, fast-paced environment, and it just makes for endless fun and fascination.
Yeah, and just to kind of touch on that, and for anybody who's joining us, we'll probably tangent a lot. The root of what we're talking about, and David and I are friends, and we get together and talk about this stuff. But we also are here with our intent from day one was to write a book on that. So we've invited people to come with us because some of this conversation might be interesting to people. And for other people, the act of going and trying to flush out a book itself might be interesting. And for some people, they just love the mentality aspects of anything or the philosophy. And other people just like fighting. This might be an interesting thing. So that's why we thought we'd invite other people to kind of come and join us. But so that makes me think about the book briefly there. And my first question that I have, okay, what do we have? We have a title. Like that's something.
Well, we do have a title. We actually have a lot more than that, but that doesn't necessarily make our task easy. So, we've been talking about this, as you mentioned, long before the podcast. And we have made lists of topics, potential chapters, things that have to be covered. And, just to make clear how detailed this can get, here's just a partial list of things we've talked about. How to become a world-class expert. Basically, how do you learn and train over the long term? But then how do you learn and train over the short term, even game planning for the next fight? What's the role of emotion? What about techniques like visualization? What are the effective ways to communicate in the corner, with a fighter in between rounds? What does it mean to break a fighter? What is it... you've talked about concepts like teaching your opponent, and the way you've used that term in a very specific way where if you show them, I guess the simplest version of this is if you show them a couple body kicks, the third time you throw a kick, they're thinking body, but suddenly you go to head. But you've taught them that kick motion is going to go to the body. You sort of taught them to expect a pattern so you could break it strategically. And I only got through about half of this random list of topics we've already talked about. So there's so much. And I think when we're talking about a book, one first place to start is what do we want to cover and what organization are we going to put that in? Right.
Well, as you look at that, that is probably 100th of the top, or, let's say 20, 5%. Let's say 5% of the quantity of things that interest us from this. So one of my sort of hesitations of the process, or one of the things I was having a hard time getting past, wasn't the what. And this is, I've thought of this over the last couple of weeks that we've been talking to get together. Wasn't the what. So we look at, let's say we have 100 things just like that. So our first thought is, what are these 100? And then it's immediately we think, how will we categorize them, or how will we group them, or how will they flow into each other? But before that, so I realized the reason that I wasn't quite ready to make groupings is because actually for me, what was the most important was why. Why are we writing this book? Not why does this happen, but who is reading this book? Who, and I think that's a very big one, because I was talking to my friend David Mullins, and we do another podcast together about, and he's a psychology consultant. So he works sort of somewhere, and his stuff is very factual, but somewhere in less in the realm of clinical and college and research and study and 8 years of academia. He works directly with people. And the first thing when I told him we were doing this, he was excited at the idea. And but he was like, well, a how-to book isn't really possible. And right away I agreed, and I think we agree. There's really no such thing as a how to be mentally strong, because although we could lay out a framework of some of these things, they're so personal. And if we're talking about motivation, for example, we could take 100 people and truly intrinsically their motivations are different. Now we can discuss whether or not we agree with that. So, but I'm thinking how to doesn't feel like what we're doing. How to be, because also that is very small. There is 500 fighters in the world that might be interested in that. So then but my thought of what I thought as a fan, where this book might be interesting, is from a fan's perspective, what is this stuff? As a way for us, the viewer, for a way as us, the writers, to ignite some excitement around these topics, so that enriches the ability of the viewer. Because for a lot of people, they love seeing Chuck Liddell throw a right hand and the guy fall down. But what is going on, and what is going on really mentally, not what might be going on, but what are some of the true things that we can talk about, and how we do that? That to me is a really interesting book. And what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I completely agree. And first of all, I really enjoy watching you and Dave Mullins on that podcast, and I really resonate with almost everything he talks about. I should note for the viewers, we're both a little sick today.
Yeah.
So it's the sniffling.
But that right there is mentality. Are you going to give it up? Are you going to just not do what you're planning to do, or are you going to just balls up, be a little sick, and do it anyways? I generally find that you'll feel better.
I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, I mean, I think I completely agree with you. And in fact, the other thing I was thinking about was, in terms of where do you start, it aligns with what you're saying. What's your target audience? What's your purpose? What are you trying to accomplish? And part of me actually does want to make a how-to book, but I run into the issue that probably you and that, David Mullins is bringing up, is that I feel like for roughly a third or half of the topics, there's some nice how-to principles that anyone could follow if they decided to follow them. But then for the rest of the stuff, which is half to the majority, it doesn't work like that. Either it's too personal, or it's too dispositional, inborn, or it just doesn't lend itself to that. And so the other reason to do this, which works for everything, is it's just fascinating. You've often talked about how the reason why you do MMA analysis is because you love it and you just desperately want to share it with others. You want them to love it too, and so you want to show them what's so cool. And for me, that's exactly why this is so interesting and fascinating. And so for me, there's so many examples, but one that comes to mind that I love sharing with people is when Shogun beat Machida in their second fight. A lot of people either hated Machida or loved Machida. I tend to love Machida. And so a lot of people found that a particularly difficult or satisfying finish. But
right.
What I really loved about that is Shogun talked about how in advance he had watched Machida's, basically his patterns. He knew that when Machida came in with a straight punch, he would leave his head exposed. Shogun talked about how he practiced over and over again, countering with a hook. And implicitly almost that he was going to eat the punch for that opportunity to throw the punch. And so he has a game plan there. And then the idea is, well, how do you make the game plan work? One thing people don't often realize is you really need to rep it hundreds, maybe thousands of times so it's instinctive, because when the fight begins, your brain goes on sort of a hyperdrive, and a lot of people have game plans that just go out the window. But his didn't go out the window. He used it exactly the right way at exactly the right moment and won that fight by knocking out Machida, who looked like everyone's kryptonite until then. And so for me, that's an example of how understanding the mental preparation that went into that really enhances how awesome that moment was, as how awesome an MMA accomplishment that was.
Yeah, I was there that night and I saw him, and then you want to talk about emotion, and I saw him and his team, many of whom I'd seen before as translator. I'd seen with him and his brother before, and you kind of recognize these people from part of the traveling circus, and you've met them and interviewed them and stuff. And he never put a shirt on. He was still wearing his pants. And in that arena in the Bell Center, I was standing in the back where some of the media goes and stuff, and they took turns carrying the belt over their head and dancing and kind of dancing around.
Yeah, Robin, I'm losing you for a moment.
Singing a bit.
Robin, we might be having our first technical difficulties.
I guess that's going to happen sometimes. So hopefully, people will bet does.
Yeah, I hear you a little bit better. But that's pretty cool. You were there and actually got to see that in person and see someone enjoying the fruits of what they did. All that physical and mental preparation coming together for just an amazing moment.
Yeah, and recently I saw Gunnar Nelson, who I've been analyzing his technical stuff, and you go through different phases as somebody who is deeply analyzing fighting, in love with the martial arts, and kind of dedicating your life to trying to solve these mysteries and share them. And that's back to that idea. I am motivated. All of my work is motivated by find the beauty, follow your curiosity to find the true beauty, and then share it with people. And why do you do that? You do it in hopes of creating change. The change you're trying to create is enhance people's understanding of fighting and their enjoyment of it, so that the whole world sees the martial arts as a bigger and more powerful thing than our typical view of it. And so if the book falls in line with that, that's great. But as had been researching Gunnar Nelson that way,
Mm-hmm.
and when you do, you go through what phases of being really obsessed with technique. And then later on, technique in and of itself, without motivation or emotion or repetition or understanding how it's trained, is just talking about how a ballet dancer moves, not actually experiencing ballet. So, but my point was that he had drawn back Brandon Thatch once, twice, three times, drew Brandon Thatch into a safety of blitzing. And then when Nelson finally committed to that one punch mid-blitz, you could see and feel that he knew it was going to come. He was going to create the scenario in which that punch could come. And when he threw it, he was going to commit with everything he had, because he knew it would come, but he knew it would come if he created a scenario in which it came. But once he recognized the scenario, that the opportunity was there, the commitment that you see on him is unbelievable. And that's the same thing that Shogun did. So there is the training, there's the research, there's the learning, then there's the training for that moment, and then there's the insane commitment. And that is probably as mental as anything. It's like when Gunnar Nelson threw that punch, it was a punch that he had been planning to throw. He was going to, under all circumstances, create it. And when he had that opportunity, it was going to be clean, and he was going to deliver with his perfect ability. But these are examples of exactly what we're talking about. So when I think about it, maybe if this is what we want to show, maybe we use anecdotes. Maybe we use moments that happened. George losing to Sarah, and Chris Weidman overcoming Anderson Silva, and Cowboy Cerrone and his failure when he looked over at Anthony Pettis, and then how he returned after. And maybe we use anecdotes. Once we show the anecdote, we go back in and really break it down and use those anecdotes to expose some of these factors and explain them.
I mean, I've always that we would be using. Yeah, sorry, I'm pausing for a moment because I'm suddenly getting feedback. All right, resolved. Second technical difficulty resolved. Yeah, I've always assumed we'd use anecdotes to illustrate whatever it is we're talking about. But I'm wondering if you're saying that maybe the book itself is organized around anecdotes. You know, we choose anecdotes strategically to show different things. They can be ordered to show certain things in a certain order. But instead of feeling this pull that we have to identify every important mental thing and get it in a certain order, we can say, let's just use fights. Any fight that illustrates, a beautiful, mental contribution to what happened. Maybe that's the way to go.
Successes, failures, massive improvements, setbacks, all of those things, but we curate ones that illustrate different things. And each time there's something really big, a really big principle, we'll take these story by story, and we'll go in and we'll find what principles were at play. And if there are some that are really key, we can go, and this happened, and that is when, and be storytelling. And that is when George St. Pierre fell and his whole world changed. End of the phrase. And then what happened in that scenario, and break down, go back, and maybe we have to interview for us, what was George doing at the time? Maybe we got to get George on the phone. Maybe we got to get Matt Serra on the phone. Take those things and find ways to expose the principles that were at play in them.
It's a beautiful idea. It really is. It's really beautiful. I mean, because that's for me is always where I get the most excited, is thinking about a particular anecdote, why it was so cool, and then trying to, make it clear how the psychological principles were so practical, so relevant. A lot of times people see psychology as this weird, amorphous, mystical, strange kind of thing. And these kinds of anecdotes are what make what psychology is and its contribution to success in combat sports so practical and understandable. and accessible for people.
And even as you were telling the Machida one, you were telling it from the perspective of, we will never ignore this happened physically and this took place and this guy was any of the other elements. But at their root, all of these things, whether it was in the 6 weeks before, or the day of, or the guy who had been because of a bad weight cut, we get the chance to talk to him about what processes he did that day to get himself in that mindset, and then look at it from actual psychological principles that you've studied all your adult life.
Yeah, no, that sounds great, and it really does. It's and one thing that makes me really like it is how excited it makes me. Immediately, just any anecdote we're going to talk about it is going to be just interesting and fun. And hopefully that means that it'll come through. I remember there was one, I think Greg Jackson got a lot of flack once for, I think it was with GSP, that it was in between rounds and GSP or whoever the fighter was said that he thinks he injured his groin, or maybe it was an Ultimate Fighter fight. Do you remember what this one was? And Greg Jackson said, hit him with your groin?
Yeah. It was somebody he had beat 4 rounds straight, and he said, hit him with your groin.
Yeah, and a lot of people kind of made fun of that, and I was thinking that's one of the most brilliant corner instructions I've ever heard, because you have a fighter who is basically worried that they're injured and can't perform. Greg Jackson has seconds to figure out what to say and how to get his fighter in the best mental state possible. He could say things like, change your stance this way to protect yourself, but what that does is put a fighter in an avoidance kind of stance that's not good for engaging. And to say hit him with your groin keeps that fighter in what we call an approach-oriented stance, an approach and overcome sort of motivational posture, not an avoidance, be afraid posture. It took him one line, just a second to deliver it, and all that fighter had to do was give their best fight for the next few minutes. When the fight's over, he can say, all right, let's protect you now.
Yeah, it was not Carlos Condit. It was back before George's major injury. I am just, because this is...
Oh, was it GSP fight? We're just trying to remember.
It was 100% George. I feel like it might have been Thiago Alves, but it was something like that where he truly did tear his groin. It was something like that where George St. God, my computer is slow. I should know this. I feel like it was Thiago Alves, but it was something around that era. But it was 100% George, and he afterwards turned out that he had a groin tear. And you're right, Greg Jackson. But that, maybe we'll get a chance if that is something we put in there, because it could be. Cornering is a topic we'll absolutely touch on. So maybe this is our first anecdote that we're going to consider as Jake Shields. No, it was before that. That was in Toronto. I think it was Thiago Alves for some reason, which was UFC 100, so there was extra pressure. Dan Hardy, which was after that. It was not Josh Koscheck, and it was certainly before that. So my feeling it was Thiago Alves, but we'll go back and we'll find it. Maybe this is
we'll figure it out. So it sounds like we're on the same page where, maybe one nice thing might be thinking about the different fights or moments that come to mind, because I'm already starting a list, so I have I have the hit him with their groin. I have the Gunnar Nelson. I remember when you shared that breakdown with me, I was absolutely, fascinated by it, because I saw exactly what you were saying. It wasn't that he, hit him with a punch that happened to be well timed. He was, analyzing a pattern. He was analyzing how his behavior made the other guy respond. He thought what he could do to take advantage of that. He then did repeated his behavior to draw the same response. Got the same, it was a beautiful example of the mental and physical coming together. So I've got that written down. Just to throw them out there, I haven't even written Machida Shogun yet. There's one where involving GSP and Condit, where GSP credits his earlier experience getting KO'd by Serra for surviving I think it was the 4th round against Condit when he got hit in the head, but survived.
Yeah.
I've got there's the Couture versus going way back now. I think Tim Sylvia, where Couture used like a low leg kick and overhand right to finish the fight really fast, and apparently had that was his game plan from the beginning, and he just did it as if it was easy. And any come to mind right now, or for you, they're just like beautiful examples of
yeah, so many to me. Like they're, you know, overcoming even failures. Like I think failures are a big part of it.
Sure.
And I think, you know, the chat I had with Weidman the other day about his failures in the NCAA finals, or in the finals, he wanted to be a national champion. He never became one. And he credits that directly with his greatness now. And I think that's big. Um, the alpha posturing stuff that I did with Uriah Faber, the 2 breakdowns where I explored this, that really, one started yours and my relationship. And when you did send me that email about that, I was in Russia dealing with 15 days straight of 12-hour brutal days. And I got a really nice email from a psychologist from the University of British Columbia, and it really did perk you up, which leads you to see how much you can be affected by these kinds of things. But the Carlos Condit, his ability to be, and I think what that one tied into, it was his adaptive unconscious, and I looked at that in detail. But I think I said he must be in a flow state. I didn't really know what a flow state was at the time, but I recognized that while breaking that down, going on 3 years ago now. And I think that that type of ability to be as free as Carlos Condit is, what is that really? I think that's interesting. I also did one on Uriah Faber and what difference your alpha posture can create. It's been studied. It was studied by that professor at Harvard about the alpha posturing and how that can even help you in an interview, not only because it may influence the person interviewing you, but it'll actually raise your testosterone and reduce your cortisol and make you perform better. So you know, little details like that, those wild card kind of things like posture. Definitely, to me, 3 things that all connect, that I think it wouldn't be one story, it would be 3, is when what's his name? When Junior Dos Santos was fighting, what's his name? Brown Pride, Cain Velasquez. I've name recall issues, as you know. I don't know if it's getting hit in the head a lot, but I do actually. And when I work with Ramdeen, I will do something like that. I'll go, you know, big guy, gold chains, goes like that, or big silver chains.
Just on the same page, he nails it.
Yeah, he'll be like, Rampage? I'm like, yeah, Rampage. I can describe in detail, it's just a name recall. But yeah, so Cain Velasquez. And as Junior Dos Santos came out to the middle of the cage to do his thing, Velasquez went up and met him in the middle. And you see it change the process where Dos Santos has never thought of that variable. It also was repeated. Rory McDonald with Jake Ellenberger, he walks in, and as they're face to face, he puts his hands up. Jake Ellenberger, who was already on the issues of pressure, still has that moment of reprise before a fight starts, and instead this Canadian psycho comes in a fighting stance, and you've never seen that in 35 fights. And also Conor McGregor, when he went in for that last moment with Dustin Poirier, and he gave him one of these, you know, any kind of thing like that, that idea of using psychology offensively. Right. I think that's an interesting one. That's a later in the book thing, because first we have to master ourselves, but later on, these are things that can even be used as tools and weapons. I think also, whether it's Chael Sonnen or Conor McGregor, and Jake Ellenberger, the role of talk and creating attention and ratcheting up pressure, I think that is relevant. You know,
it is, and I'm wondering now if you know, we could still structure the book around these different.
I think I lost you there for a moment. More technical issues.
Each of these, yeah, you're back though, I think.
Yeah. You were saying we could structure the book around these anecdotes still.
Yeah, so right. So that was sort of the idea you introduced, and I still love the idea. And you know, one of the things, you know, I guess it's worth mentioning is, so I've written a book on self-injury, and I've published an edited volume on a popular psychology volume. So this usually what I publish are journal articles that other psychologists read, but not really the general public. But I just say that to give context to the various assumptions I bring in terms of how to approach something. So that said, usually when I'm at the beginning of a project, I'll have multiple ideas in mind for how it can go, and that's fine. That's comfortable.
Yeah.
I'll just do both at the same time. So, a moment ago I was thinking, well, really this anecdote, that's the best way to go. It's structured around different anecdotes. But now I'm also thinking, these anecdotes very quickly have labels. We have examples of, good cornering. We have examples of game planning. We have examples of using psychology, offensively. We have examples of using failure to inform success later. So, who knows, maybe we'll end up going back to organized around themes. But, either one will work. And I guess we'll see where, we can make that decision much later on.
Yes. And interestingly, too, you, as you just pointed out, a lot of your writing revolves around these fact-telling and illustrating points. That's what it is to write those kinds of papers, to make real concrete points. Whereas I'm an entertainer on a lot of levels. So although I am, my breakdown, for example, is intended to teach you something. But I found out over time that the best way to teach you something was to trick you into learning it by finding a way to make it fun and entertaining. And so my primary motivation is teach you something. But over time, I've got better and better at disguising that within the world of storytelling and entertainment.
Right. I was going to argue with you at first, because when you called yourself an entertainer, I was thinking, you entertain, but that's not what you do at your core. You teach and you inform. But
that is my primary
else you said after that, I agree with. You definitely.
It is my primary motivation to teach and inform and share ideas. But I found that you can do that better by having some fun. And that's, I think, why, because that's been at such the core of how I've been learning to, again, if the goal is to make people know more about fighting because they'll love it, how do I do that? At first, I used to get so frustrated as I would watch people so much garbage press. And I'd be like, this isn't helping. And even my friends who do some of that type of reporting would be like, I don't understand what you mean. The point isn't to help. But they don't have the same motivation. My motivation is make everyone see that martial arts will make your life better. So that may not be a normal motivation. But as I tried to do that, I was batting my head against the wall going, why don't people get excited about a level change? And then later you realize if you could drape it in fun and entertainment and passion and the other things, they could do it. But I think it's with that same thinking that I'm like, if you tell the story of a cocky, arrogant George St. Pierre who's been out dancing and drinking martinis and the way he approached training, and as he strolled in, you tell it from a first person of this cocky, arrogant guy, and he'd probably support that, and Faraz would probably tell us that, but if you could tell it from his point of view, and then as he sat there, and as he felt the punches hit his head, and he fell, and he saw the lights move up on it, he thought, oh my God, I'm not the greatest in the world. And if you told it that, finished that story, and then went back, where did things start to go wrong? Well, it was the day that after his last victory, George truly believed, and then go back and break it down in the principles. That to me feels like through storytelling, at the end of the book, people go, I read a whole bunch of really neat things about fighting. And then when they watch fighting later, they'd go, oh yeah, that guy's pattern setting. You know what I mean? Like the default would be they would have learned about psychology.
Right, and you clearly have an expertise in that. I mean, I'm used to explaining things clearly, but as it turns out, boringly.
Unless you already love the topic.
Right, unless you already love and care about the topic and in some sense need it. I'm a very successful writer in my academic field, but I've learned very quickly from watching your success how you can marry the two. A lot of times people think that substance and entertainment are somehow mutually exclusive, but if you can start with substance and then you can to deliver that in an entertaining context, man, that's just very few people can do that. But I think that's frankly why people really enjoy your analysis. And Joe Rogan does that. just through his passion. I think Joe Rogan gets so excited that draws people in emotionally, and then he also has that ability to teach very well. But there's very few people who are very good at that, at least in the MMA world and probably in general.
Yeah, because fundamentally, I think you have to give a shit about both a lot. And thank you, by the way. Joe is a good friend, and I think the reason that we get along is we both have that kind of thing. And Chael is becoming a really good friend now. And Chael's whole thing is like, yeah, you say a lot of really great stuff, and you have a lot of, but your passion is what I'm attached to. And it's nice to hear nice things, but ultimately, the only reason that you'll get better at anything is if you are seeking to get better at things. And again, that's a foundation of what we're talking about here. You know, and that is right back to George. Why did George lose that fight? He will tell you, for us, will tell you, even Matt Serra, although Matt Serra will say, I punched that guy so hard. And Matt Serra's perspective will be awesome too. But George lost that fight because George started believing he was the greatest. And if you already believe you're the greatest, why would you need to outwork anybody?
Yeah, and that also just translates to, you know, what happened from there, because you can also imagine, you know, and I've not talked to, you know, GSP or for us as a hobby, but I do know that GSP said in an interview that he survived that head kick in the Condit fight because of the Serra experience. And so you can imagine, you know, he got hit. I think he got hit on the temple, so he was more sort of disoriented as opposed to having his, you know, lights turned off. But he lost, and basically it was probably thinking some jumbled version of what's happening. This is all new. I'm not even sure how to react, and you lost. And in Condit, you can imagine the narrative was more like, I've been here before.
Yeah.
I've done this before, and I know how to handle it better now. He covered up, he survived, you know, got right back and finished the fight the same way he began the fight.
Yeah. In that same fight. So let's say we started with George. He's one of the big. I mean, ultimately,
he also talks about power posing, by the way. So he really does go into. He's thought a lot about the mental part, and as a result, you know, is relevant to a lot. Anyway, sorry to interrupt.
No. I think ultimately the order won't matter because, like you said, there are many ways to do it. But even if it's anecdote based, the order will make sense as what are the either something super complex that you introduce that you end with. I mean, George getting knocked out and then beating Condit, maybe bookends, but that structural thing, you don't matter. But maybe you start with something very complicated that's almost impossible to explain, and then through a series of other ones, you explain the details that happened there. But that idea as ways to break down what's at play, that feels like a book that, one, people might like, and two, serves that. If our goal is we want people to see how awesome fighting is, and through seeing what psychological things are at play, we create that to happen. This feels like the kind of way to do that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm sold. I think you're onto something. And yeah, I was really struggling for a long time. You know, do we break it down by topic, and if so, what are the themes? Or maybe we break it down by, you know, the large perspective. You know, becoming an elite mixed martial artist, and then training camps, and, you know, breaking it down by time frame, the day before the fight, during the fight itself. But I think what you're saying just makes so much more sense. It's interesting. It makes sense. It allows us to, you know, deliver, you know, the things that we find exciting and important, and really, you know, practical, useful, and fun ways. It just makes a lot of sense.
Plus, it'll also, I think, I'd never thought of this till you were just saying that, and as you were saying that, it made me kind of see this perspective. If you took people on, let's say 10, let's say 12, let's say 15, let's say 5, however it ends up working, pathways through fights. The fight itself, sometimes it'll be the training, sometimes it'll be the 8 years it took Chris Weidman to learn those lessons, sometimes it'll be what they learned in the cage, but all those different anecdotes, if you walk people through those, at the end of the book, they'll start to walk through fights that way on their own. So not only will all these topics get shown, but you will have walked people through the idea of the fact that, yes, there's punching and kicking and choking happening, but there is a psychic flow, a psychic battle that happens from the day these two start their career to the day they meet, to the day they fight, to all of those things. And I think that aspect actually might be a bigger side effect of doing it better side effect of doing it this way, even than the small learning, you know?
Yeah. I'm actually, I'm keeping notes on some of the things we're talking about, and was writing something down from what you said. Yeah, because one thing that I really enjoy all the different examples we've talked about, and yet other than I think the Weidman one, we've really been focusing on more short-term ones. Why did that person land that punch? Why did they survive? That particular moment of adversity in a fight. And a lot of the really interesting ones to me also are over a very long perspective. Some fighters evolve and some don't. You can talk a lot about Vitor Belfort, in terms of the whole performance enhancing stuff. And, maybe there's a place for us to discuss that too. But one thing that's kind of neat about him is he went from an overwhelming puncher to a guy who has incredibly fearsome kicks. And that's not a trivial evolution. There's a lot of people who are just punchers and they kind of just stay that way. And then there's other people who really meaningfully evolve over the course of their career. Ronda Rousey's a really interesting one. She's interesting for a million reasons, but one of them is at no point did she have the thought, oh, my judo's pretty good, I know everything I need to know. Right. She's such a student. She's working so hard to improve her game, and we're starting to see her become more and more well-rounded, and that's a mental quality that is not a given, and that can make a huge difference.
Yeah, and there's an argument that is more important than anything, because if you have the ability to continue to improve, if you have the ability to learn, and everything you learn stacks on everything else, then it doesn't really matter where you're at today, because ultimately you're going to be better tomorrow and in a month and in a year and in 3 years. And that may be the most important sort of aspect of all. But it's all of these things that we're talking about. Every single one of them has examples,
right?
And I don't think these examples are only fights. I think they are. Ronda Rousey was born in this year, and at age this she started. Some of these are, whether these are done chapters or multiple chapters or things that you respond to. I think it's a complicated structure, but and again, this just still talking about, layout things. But if, there are 10 chapters to a book, and 1 and 3 and 7 and number 10 all go back to one person's story. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean?
So yeah. There's sort of a thread that's evolving.
Yeah. And that one could be Ronda. It could be George. It could be Weidman. It could be Conor McGregor. Or, or maybe there are ways, maybe through some of the very greatest and their anecdotes as we're writing them, what we discover is some benchmark things that do happen. It will bring them all in as examples.
Right.
But I think I think it is in the studying of these athletes and their short, medium, long-term paths, we find examples. Those examples lead us to explanations of what's taking place. And I think that's a good way to do it. And even structurally, because one of the reasons I was having a hard time, as we've talked about it before, was what are the topics? Well, I mean, how we would talk about the topic of cornering. There are that's a whole book.
Yeah,
it felt so open-ended to me that I wasn't sure. But if we use Greg Jackson cornering George, now we are searching for explanations in a single thing. This may not be the best scientific method, but it gets people, it introduces ideas, and it gets you talking about topics. And we'll go back to maybe at times while we are telling one story, which is maybe a long story, somebody's short anecdote within that story will help support it,
Right. And so part of what we'll be doing is sort of thinking of particular anecdotes, whether it's fighters or fights, that are things we want to include, as we, we're creating sort of the agenda for the book, but that's part of what we'll be doing is identifying those fights or fighters, some of which will be moments. Now, we'll also sometimes have principles that we know we want to get in and then work the other way. What's the best fighter or fight to illustrate that? one that comes to mind, and you'll probably think of a better way to talk about this. It's actually relevant to the Holly Holm Ronda Rousey fight coming up. It's that you reminded me of it when you mentioned level changes.
Yeah.
So I don't expect Rousey to try to box with Holly Holm at all. Despite the success with Bethe Correia, just a totally different fighter, and Rousey's smart enough not to do that. And yet, it does occur to me that it's not that Rousey has to be have better stand-up than Holm. Rousey's stand-up against Holm needs to be better than Holm's stand-up under the conditions where Holly is constantly worried about the clinch and the takedown.
Yeah.
So Holly has to strike within this very specific limitation that she cannot let the distance close. Whereas Rousey doesn't have to worry about that at all. And it probably doesn't fully equalize the striking game. If Rousey wins, it's probably not going to be with a knockout punch, or maybe when Rousey wins. But it's a great equalizer, and I bet there's lots of examples. And it's a very, very mental kind of thing. So there's probably examples of inferior strikers knocking out someone else on the feet because the better striker had to worry about the takedown. And so that's one that
Gabriel Gonzaga head kicked Crow Cup.
Nice.
And completely dropped him. But that is a different era, because right now, Holly, the idea of defending a takedown used to be, you are shooting on me. Oh my God, I got to defend the takedown.
Right. And I sprawl.
Right. Yeah, exactly. But that only happens now if I have failed on 3 or 4 or 5 assignments before that. And so I hear a lot of people, they'll be talking about, and it's very limited when I hear technique people. They'll be like, well, this guy's striking is good, but this guy's takedown defense is not. Takedown defense is no longer even a first of all, I don't think there are. It's not like Dungeons and Dragons where you have strength, dexterity, constitution, whatever, and you give them arbitrary numbers, and then analyzing fighting is comparing those two.
Right.
And even if it were, takedown defense is no longer it. You don't have to worry about stopping Ronda's takedown if you have done 2 or 3 things right in the first place. And if you
this control is really where the main success has to happen.
And where and how you move through ranges. Right. And if you have successfully made Ronda chase you, and if when Ronda chases you, you're pivoting in a certain way, those things all make it so you shouldn't have to stop her takedown, because there is no takedown. Unfortunately, at some point there becomes one. When it happens, Conor McGregor, his attitude was, they say you can't kick a guy who wants to take you down. Fuck that. I'm going to kick Chad Mendes right in the liver. I'm going to kick him right in the stomach. And if he takes me down, I'll get back up. And what he chose to do was prioritize but also he has the ability that every time he hits you, he hurts you. And that's a fact. Whether somebody hates Conor McGregor or not doesn't change the fact that everything he hits with hurts. So he's like, if I hit you 2 times and you take me down, those 2 hits will do enough damage that it should help me with the assignment of getting up. But ultimately, I think in this fight, what might be a really interesting way to do our next conversation is, one, let's keep thinking about these ideas of how we're going to use anecdotes to support these things. And 2, since Ronda Rousey's fighting this weekend, and I mean, it happens to be a Wednesday or Thursday or whatever, when we're having this conversation. Hopefully our friends over at MMA Latest have this up by the weekend. And the following week, let's start with Ronda. Let's start with anecdotes that you and I both come up with. Probably the weekend's fights will lead us to something. But let's also come in with a few Ronda-related anecdotes and just start there. It won't be chapter 1. It'll just be topical. It'll be in the front of our minds. We'll be thinking about it all weekend as we watch her fight. And we'll come in with some Ronda-related anecdotes to kind of start this off.
No, that sounds great. It's going to be a lot of fun. I'm actually going to be in a conference in Chicago weekend, but I've got on my calendar to find a way to watch it anyway.
Yeah. We're at Chicago, so you're in Eastern Standard Time.
Central Chicago.
Or Central, okay. So that fight will take place probably around 11:30 p.m. where you are.
Right.
And you'll be out of your conference at that time?
Yep. Yep.
So,
I mean, usually you go out with your conference buddies in the evenings, but I'll just have to find some conference buddies that want to watch some fights because I can't imagine.
This one contains a big star, so there'll be somebody that goes. And if you don't, then I'll find a legal link to send you on Sunday. But yeah, let's watch that this weekend. Let's take these ideas that we have of how to lay out these, really revisit our concepts of using anecdotes to lead us to topics, which lead us to breaking things down in a way from the psychology of what's happening. Maybe there's a formula that we're using. Story, what's really happening, what's happening physiologically, what's happening psychologically, what led to this. Maybe there's something that cut and dried, and maybe it's just storytelling,
That sounds great.
And let's just come in with our thoughts on Ronda versus Holly Holm, and maybe some other Ronda anecdotes, and let's just chat it out, and that'll be episode 2. We forgot that we had friends here along with us, maybe 10 friends, maybe 100 friends. But if we do this, I think there'll be some people that might be interested. Let's encourage them to send us thoughts and ideas. Hopefully,
definitely. Input would only help for sure.
Yeah, and I think that will help. And sometimes, if I'm not here, some weeks, like, we'll do it so informal that some days you start the chat, some days you lead it, some days we'll have an open-ended chat. Maybe we'll have somebody that is watching that has some thoughts for us, and we'll find a way to bring them in.
Sounds great. Yeah, easy to do too.
Yeah. And what? Any other thoughts that you got?
No, I like where we're at. So yeah, I feel optimistic that we actually have sort of an idea for how to structure this thing and how to make it really interesting that we didn't, an hour ago. So I think while there's still a ton of open-ended work to be done, we accomplished a lot.
Yeah, I feel like we did too, and I feel like this, and I think it's going to be fun to bring some people along for the ride, particularly if they instigate some thoughts for us or give us some feedback or whatever. And the guys over at MMA Latest, who do a great job, I think are going to post this. So if people see it there, they can leave us messages there. If this is hosted on your YouTube site, they can leave us messages there. And let's try to get together next week and talk about Ronda's fight. I mean, if Holly Holm found a way to upset her, obviously that would be where we started. If Ronda goes in and has her third consecutive under a minute, or fourth, or whatever it is, obviously we're going to start with how that's possible. What's actually happening there? Is it just skill, or is it something else? And we know it's something else too. And I think that'll give us a place to start.
Yeah, no, it definitely will. I'm fascinated to see what Ronda's game plan is going to be, and so much so that I'm holding myself back from talking about it because I think we're at a good place to stop right now. So I will save those thoughts for next time, and yeah, people will already know the answer then. Yeah,
people already know the answer, and it's important. We're honest. If you are having just the same way as if you're a Muay Thai fighter who has 400 fights, you lose 1 or 2 in the context of a real career of learning. Those don't matter. I think analysis is the same way. If you analyze 1,000 fights and you're dead wrong, it's important to know you were dead wrong and what you were wrong about, and it'll make you better. So we'll be honest about what we were thinking and what we thought we might see. Personally, I do think Holly has a better chance than any of the last people that Ronda faced, for the primary reason that there is at least a game plan, which nobody else has seemed to have. So
yeah. I mean, I've actually got an article into MMA Latest that they're going to post. They've just been waiting to post it, but I saw your 5 rounds breakdown. Very, very similar. The game plan's been a nightmare for the other opponents because people like Miesha Tate, Sarah McMahon, Kat Zingano, they had to avoid the combat ranges, the close in combat ranges that usually they enjoy. They had to game plan to do the opposite. Holly Holm at least gets to game plan the way she always does.
Yeah.
Just strike from the outside, use distance control, use footwork and angles. So she has to do it for a long time without failing. That's the hard part. But there's a path to victory that actually matches her strengths.
Yeah, and at the same time, Ronda could have her out of there in a minute. and we wouldn't be surprised by that either. But I sure wouldn't be surprised to see a busted up Holly Holm, who maybe lost round 1 and maybe survived some real scares, back on the outside, later in round 2 or 3, doing it, and then you'd be like, well, this fight isn't over. At least there's a possibility. But having said that, when somebody is that good and that dominant, you can't be surprised if John Jones wins the next fight, or if Demetrius Johnson wins the next fight. Never mind Ronda, who's more dominant than any of them. So,
yeah. All right, I'm going to hold myself back because I think we've accomplished a lot.
Yeah.
I think we're at a good stopping point, and I can't wait to talk more.
Cool, man. Thanks to everybody who has joined us, and let us know what you think. And this can be fun. Maybe we'll. Maybe in a year or 2, we'll have a book, and hopefully we've had a bunch of people join us for the making of it and maybe contribute to it.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks, Robin, for doing this, and thanks everyone for joining us.
Cheers. Bye.
Part of it. See ya.